The Siders family is the most hated family in America right now. Most people look at the Siders parents and the grandparents and see a family that simply just fell through the cracks. This case, mind-blowing. It has caused many to question the very human capacity for cruelty. But as a therapist, when I look at the alleged mechanics of how 16 children were kept hidden for years, I don't see a mistake. I see a textbook case of a closed family system. This is a highly organized, multi-generational architecture designed to keep the outside world out and the private reality in. Today, we're unpacking the mental health indicators of the architects behind this closed system. When a case like this breaks, the public outcry is almost always directed at the state, the social workers, the school systems, the neighbors who didn't see. But as a clinician, I'm looking at something much more intentional and much more resilient. I see what I call the psychological double lock. In a typical case of parental isolation, there is often a grandparent or an aunt who acts as a reality anchor, someone who sees the dysfunction and tries to pull the family back toward the norm. But in the Siders case, we allegedly see the opposite. I say allegedly because nothing's proven yet. The first lock was the parents who created a private, isolated reality for these 16 children. But the second lock, the one that made the system virtually impenetrable, was the grandparents. By allegedly participating in the secrecy and validating the parents' distortions, the grandparents didn't just help the parents. They codified the delusion. In the minds of perpetrators, if two generations are doing it, it's no longer wrong. It's just the family way. It's just how we do things. This is the double lock, a multi-generational reinforcement where the very people who should have been the safety net had become the architects of this enclosure. It's really critical to remember that this is actually an ongoing investigation. As we walk through this deep dive, I want to analyze the public reports and the available footage through a clinical lens. We aren't here to declare a legal guilt. It's not my role. My role as a licensed therapist is to understand the mental health indicators and the why behind the perpetrators. We're looking at the system of the Siders family as a case study in how intergenerational control can allegedly bypass the conscience and keep 16 human beings hidden in plain sight. To understand the Siders parents, we have to look at the grandparents first, the individuals that I refer to as the primary architect. In clinical practice, we know that a system of this complexity rarely emerges from a vacuum. It's often a scaled-up version of a blueprint that was drafted decades earlier. And when we look at the grandparents' alleged involvements, we have to ask ourselves, was the concept of the family versus the world a value system that was passed down? It's an interesting thought. We often see a pattern called intergenerational transmission of control. This occurs when one generation establishes a high control environment where secrecy is labeled as privacy and isolation is marked as protection. If the parents grew up in a world where the grandparents were the sole source of truth, they didn't just learn a behavior, they inherited a restrictive worldview. In this clinical analysis, this clinical breakdown, we're looking for indicators that the Siders' grandparents may have provided a psychological permission, if you will, for the system to exist. When the older generation validates the younger generation's distortions, it creates a very powerful, very closed feedback loop. The Sider's parents weren't just acting alone. They were allegedly operating within a framework that had been pre-approved by their own parental figures. This is the primary blueprint, a belief that the family unit is a sovereign nation where outside laws, social norms, and even basic human rights simply just don't apply. This creates what we call a God complex within the family structure, where the adults believe they are the ultimate moral authority over the lives of all of their children. It supersedes the state, and they're exempt from the standard social contract. Next, we have to analyze the reported background of the Sider's family through the lens of extreme enmeshment. In a healthy family, there is a permeable membrane, if you will. Information and people go out, and new ideas and influences come back in. In this case, though, the membrane appears to have been allegedly replaced by a brick wall. Enmeshment is a clinical state where individual boundaries are blurred to the point that the self is swallowed by the unit. In this system, the children, and even perhaps the parents themselves, may not have been viewed as individuals with their own rights, but rather as property or extensions of a collective family body. When you have 16 children allegedly hidden, the psychological safe haven becomes a shared prison. From a mental health perspective, the Sider's family may have used the concept of safety as an actual weapon of control. By labeling the outside world, doctors, teachers, government, and even other relatives as inherently dangerous. Don't go there, they're evil, we don't want anything to do with them. Or even corrupt. They create a high-stakes psychological environment. They brainwash those in their household. The safe haven is no longer about comfort. It's about survival against a manufactured external threat. This is a common indicator in a cultic family dynamics within a cult, where the leaders position themselves as the only source of safety in a hostile environment and universe. The deeper the enmeshment, the more impossible it becomes for any member of the system to even imagine leaving. Because leaving doesn't just mean moving out. It means a psychological death, a cutoff, severe cutoff, emotional cutoff if you leave. For the Sider's family adults, maintaining this enmeshment was likely their only way to maintain their own fragile sense of self-importance and avoid the shame of being perceived as ordinary or fallible. We also need to chronologically map what I call the isolation escalation. Systems like the one allegedly found in the Sider's home don't just start with 16 children in the basement. They start with small, socially acceptable shifts that slowly drift into pathology. In a clinical sense, this is the transition from the private living to predatory isolation. It often begins with homeschooling or off-the-grid living, choices that are perfectly legal and often healthy in most contexts. Homeschooling can be a great alternative. However, in a dysfunctional system like the one allegedly built by the Sider's family, these choices were weaponized. They're used to slowly clip the wings of the family members' social connections until the family is the only thing left. We only have each other. We have to look out for one another. We look for what's called an incremental boundary push. This is the choice to limit the outside influences for religious or educational reasons. At this stage, the family may still appear normal, but maybe a little quirky to outsiders, which allows them to bypass early detection, ironically. This is where the Siders family allegedly begins to monitor all communications and restrict access to anyone who isn't a validated part of the system, specifically the grandparents. This creates a monopoly of truth within the home. If the children have no outside reality anchor, the parents' version of reality becomes the only reality. This deception is inherently passed down from generations. This is the most chilling stage. By the time 16 children are being hidden, the Siders family has successfully shifted the baseline of reality entirely. What would be a crisis for the average person living in total secrecy and fear discovery? It just becomes just Tuesday for them. It's just normal. As a clinician, I look at this escalation as a way to bypass the human conscience. If you move the boundary 1 inch a day, you push the boundary a little bit each and every day, you can travel a mile into pathology without ever feeling like you've crossed a line. This is how the Siders family allegedly maintained their calm, incongruent affect. They weren't hiding a crime. In their own minds, they were maintaining their system. No one understands our system. Only us. Only we do. In their worldview, they were the heroes of their own story, protecting their family from the world they had been conditioned to fear. We also need to look at the role of the grandparents as the force multiplier. In many cases of isolation, the system eventually breaks because one adult develops a reality leak. They see the harm being done and then they reach out for help. But when the grandparents are allegedly integrated into the secret, that leak is plugged in. The Siders grandparents didn't just provide physical help, they provided psychological validation. In a clinical setting, we look at this from a form of shared delusional disorder. When the parents looked at the grandparents, they didn't just see judgment or call reality. They actually saw a mirror reflecting back their own distorted belief that they were doing the right thing. This is the generational seal, is what makes the Siders case so unique and so difficult to penetrate. It suggests a level of commitment to a single isolated narrative that requires the active participation of every single adult in that house. This isn't just about the one person's mental health. It's about a pathological family culture. It's the entire family system. In this culture, loyalty is redefined as silence, and love is redefined as control. The grandparents, by allegedly remaining silent and supportive, became the bedrock upon which this isolation was built. Without their validation, the parent system would likely have collapsed under its own weight years ago. By the end of this developmental blueprint, we see that the Siders case isn't just about a house in the woods. It's about a multi-generational fortress built on the bricks of enmeshment, the mortar of shared delusion, and the blueprint of intergenerational control. This is why the investigation is so complex, and this is why so many people hate the Siders family. They very quickly came out, and it's very difficult to have compassion on adults who have done this to children. It's not just about uncovering physical evidence. It's about deconstructing a psychological system that has been decades in the making. So sad. The Siders family didn't just hide the children. They allegedly built a reality where the children were never meant to be found in the first place, ever. Understanding this blueprint is the only way to understand how such a closed system could even exist in the modern world today. We're not talking about back in the 1900s or the 1800s. We're talking about the 21st century. When you look at the footage and the reports of the Siders' parents during the initial investigation, one clinical observation stands out to me above all else, and it's called incongruent affect. In a crisis, especially one involving the removal of children, the baseline human response is high arousal distress, grief, or panic, or all three all at once. However, the Siders' parents often appeared remarkably calm, even detached, or focused on their own perceived persecution. It's on them. As a clinician, I see this as the victim mask. This is a sophisticated psychological defense where the individual reframes their control as protection and their isolation as a sanctuary. I've talked about the victim mask before. It's like in their minds that they aren't the ones causing the harm. They are the ones being victimized by an intrusive state or a judgmental society. This reframe is a powerful factor because it allows the parent to bypass the internal alarm system of the conscience that most parents have. They don't just see 16 children being deprived of social development. They see 16 children being saved from a corrupt world. Amazing that they have that mindset. When you hear them speak about their right to raise their family as they see fit, you're hearing the language of a pathological autonomy. They've allegedly built a reality where their authority is absolute, and any challenge to that authority is processed as an act of aggression against the family unit. Of course, families have a right to raise their children. Of course, families have a right to homeschool the children, but not like this. This is why they don't look like criminals in a traditional sense. They look like martyrs for a cause that they created themselves. This victim mask is the primary tool of the operator. It keeps the children compliant by making them believe the parents are their only true allies. And it keeps the outside world at bay by weaponizing the language of parental rights. Now I want to move to the most complex part of this clinical file, and probably the most horrible thing to think about. In many cases of isolation, the system is eventually breached because a family member outside of the immediate home notices the reality leak. But the Siders' grandparents, I'm a grandparent. I can't imagine this. But the grandparents allegedly function as a secondary enclosure. Instead of being the bridge to the outside world, hey, something's going on here, this is wrong, they became the second wall of the fortress. The fortress became stronger because of them, not weaker. Why would a grandparent stay silent? Why not call for help immediately? I would. You would. But from a mental health perspective, we have to look at this as narcissism. In this dynamic, the reputation of the family name is viewed as more valuable than the individual reality of the children. Wow. For the grandparents, admitting that their own children, the parents who allegedly engaged in high control, isolating behavior, would actually mean admitting a failure in their own parenting and their own legacy. To protect their ego, the family's image, they allegedly validated the parents' distortions. This creates a double validation loop. The parents look to the grandparents for approval, and the grandparents provide it to maintain the family's special or set-apart status. This is the force multiplier effect. When 16 children look at the adults in their lives as their support system, and they should most of the time, and then they see a united front of silence and secrecy, they lose the ability to name their own experience as harmful. They lose their own agency. If grandma and grandpa say this is normal, then normal is redefined. It must be normal. The grandparent's silence isn't just a lack of action. It's a psychological endorsement that cements the children's isolation. As we look at the alleged living conditions of the Siders' home, the lack of outside contact, the monitoring of information, the total reliance on the adults, we're seeing a textbook example of coercive control. I've talked about this before in other videos as well. It's a common mistake to think of control as purely physical. And in clinical practice, we know that the most effective cages are built out of information and emotion. It's like an invisible cage. Coercive control is the reason these 16 children allegedly didn't or couldn't seek help. When a system is under total monopoly of truth held by the Siders adults, the children's sense of agency is systematically eroded. They are taught that the outside is a place of certain destruction, while the inside is the only place of safety. This creates a state of traumatic bonding, where the very people causing the isolation are viewed as the only people who can provide the protection. Do you see how that manipulation and that brainwashing can affect children, can affect adults as well? The Siders family allegedly used a slow drip method of control. It wasn't just about locked doors. It was about the constant subtle suggestion that the children were too special or even too different for the world. This is how the adults bypassed the children's natural instinct for autonomy. By the time the children reached an age where they might have questioned the system, the internalized guard was already in place. They didn't need to be physically restrained if they believed the outside world would destroy them the moment that they stepped out off the property. The most chilling behavioral indicator in this breakdown is the unified front between the two generations. In a healthy family, conflict is a sign of individual autonomy. Grandparents and parents often disagree on how to raise children. But in the Siders clinical map, we see a lack of healthy conflict. The loyalty to secret was apparently more important than the well-being of the 16 children within the system. This suggests a shared pathological narrative. The adults, the operators and the validators, they allegedly collaborated to maintain a theater of normalcy for the outside world while operating a system of enclosure within the home. When you see them in the court or in news footage or you read about them, you see that unified front try to come out. It's not really a sign of family strength. It's a sign of a closed system where the truth is viewed as a threat and the children's reality is the ultimate sacrifice. By deconstructing these behaviors, we see that the Siders case isn't just about one house or not even one family. It's a study in how adults can allegedly use their roles as protector to build an architecture of isolation that lasts for years and has devastating effects. The victim mask, the secondary enclosure, and the coercive control, they're the tools they use to keep 16 children hidden in plain sight. Understanding these mechanics is the only way we can begin to see the red flags in other closed systems before they become impenetrable. As we close the clinical file on the Siders case, we have to look past the headlines and the shock of the 16 hidden children. Yes, it's very shocking. I couldn't believe it when I read it. Very shocking. But the macro lesson here isn't just about the extremes of isolation. It's about the subtle, dangerous way a family's private reality can be systematically transformed into a psychological prison. In my years as a therapist, I have seen that the most effective prisons, they don't have iron bars. They're built with the bricks of distorted loyalty and the mortar of shared delusion. The Siders case is an extreme example of that closed system, where the adults, the parents, and the grandparents allegedly collaborated to overwrite the reality of 16 kids. But the lesson for us and for anyone concerned with mental health advocacy is to recognize that helper red flag. This is a phenomenon when the enablers, like the Siders' grandparents, appear to the outside world as supportive or a loyal family member. They look like they are just helping out or respecting privacy. But in a clinical sense, they're actually reinforcing a harmful, high-control system. We have to learn to distinguish between healthy support and pathological validation. Healthy support encourages growth, autonomy, and connection to the outside world. Pathological validation, which we allegedly see in this case, encourages isolation, secrecy, and the erasure of individual identity. When an enabler validates a perpetrator's distortion, they aren't being loyal. They're becoming a secondary architect of this enclosure. They're providing the double lock that makes the system so difficult to penetrate. The helper red flag reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous person in a high control system isn't the one shouting the orders. It's the one quietly holding the door shut in the name of family unity. One of the most significant takeaways from this case is the danger of what I call the sovereign family narrative. This is the belief that a family unit is entirely exempt from the social contract and that parental rights are absolute, even when they infringe upon basic developmental and human rights of the children. In a healthy society, we value privacy and parental autonomy. However, the Siders family allegedly weaponized these values to create a monopoly of truth. When a family system becomes sovereign in this way, it stops being a place of nurturing and starts a cult of personality centered around the parents. I want you to understand that isolation is an oxygen of control. Without a reality anchor from the outside world, like doctors, teachers, friends, the children have no baseline to understand that their experience is abnormal. This is why the sovereign family is such a high-risk indicator. When a family cuts off all external feedback loops, they're effectively removing the brakes from their own psychological pathology. They can drift deeper and deeper into a distorted reality because there's no one left to say, this isn't right. This leads us to a very difficult truth about our role as observers. When we see a closed system like the Siders family, our instinct is often to respect their privacy or to mind our own business. Makes sense in most cases. But from a mental health perspective, we also have to ask ourselves, at what point does minding our own business become complicity in someone else's isolation? The Siders case highlights the desperate need for clinical vigilance in our communities. It challenges us to look closer at the quiet families, the off-the-grid systems, the ultra-private dynamics, the family that has a little bit of quirks. We need to pay attention. It's not about being intrusive. It's about understanding that every human being, especially every child, has a right to a permeable reality, a life that includes connections, perspectives, and protections outside of their immediate household. When we see signs of autonomy erasure, we have a clinical and moral obligation to look past the victim mask of the parents and see the individuals who are being swallowed by the system. When loyalty becomes a weapon, we often look at cases like the Sider's family and ask the same question. How did the children survive? How did they go through that? It's a testament to the human spirit that they did. But as we look at the architects of this alleged system, the parents who operated it and the grandparents who validated it, the more chilling clinical question is this. At what point does a family's loyalty stop being a virtue and start becoming a psychological weapon?